Hi, young adults. We're back here for part two of Module 48. So we left off talking about the idea of secure and insecure attachment in Mary Ainsworth's study. So once again, she's studying this idea of like how do you produce or influence the attachment in young children. So the question becomes, is attachment, right, that emotional bond that you experience with another person, is that a result of your parenting, which is talking about your environment? Right? That's that nurture argument in psychology. Or is attachment the result of a baby's temperament? And temperament's talking about genetics, right? So temperament is a person's characteristic emotional reactivity and intensity. So I think of when you see the word temperament, think of temper, right? Like what's someone's emotional reactivity, like how intense are they in their personality? And so temperament is linked to your genetics, right? So that's kind of the theory, right? Is it relating to your environment or is it relating to your genetics? And so your book talked to you about how heredity predisposes temperament in babies, right? So that your temperament, your emotional reactivity, your intensity is linked to your genetics. And so your book talked to you a little bit about like three different temperaments that are commonly used, like an quote unquote easy baby, cheerful, relaxed, predictable in feeding, sleeps well, sleeps in a pattern. That's like an easy baby. And some of you probably were easy babies, right? Then they have what's called difficult babies, very irritable, intense emotions, unpredictable in terms of behavior or wants and needs. My best friend has a 6 week old child, and she would call it a difficult baby. Sometimes they would use the word colicky, right? Like irritable, intense. Her second daughter's name is Margot, the one that we're talking about here. And she's always crying. That's what my best friend would say, like always crying. And her first child was not like that. She would be quote unquote an easy baby, very cheerful, very relaxed, fun loving, like just doesn't have extremes in her emotional temperament. And then there's what we would call slow to warm up, right? Generally speaking, they resist or withdraw from new people and situations. And as you expose them to those new people kind of over and over again, then they will form more attachments with those people that they see over and over again. So that's slow to warm up. The argument your book was trying to make is that generally speaking, forming a secure attachment can lead a baby to have quote unquote an easier temperament, right? So it's trying to argue that secure attachments are related to, so the environment is related to the genetic piece, right? So over and over again, you're going to see how environment and genetics play with each other, that nature via nurture as opposed to nature versus nurture. So question number 6, how does attachment influence your later relationships? This is where you're going to see the appearance of a guy that we're going to talk about later in a later section in development, and that's Erik Erikson. So his argument is going to be that securely attached children, they approach life with a sense of what he calls basic trust. So basic trust is the idea that the world is predictable and reliable. So why would an infant think that the world is predictable and reliable? Well, securely attached children have learned that they can trust that their caregivers are going to take care of them, right? So securely attached infants, like when they cry, they know that they're going to be comforted, right? So a crying infant knows that over and over again, if the mom or the dad or the other mom or whoever it might be, the caregiver, when the infant cries and they get picked up and they're comforted and soothed, or they get fed and a reliable pattern, like those things are going to produce the sense in an infant that the world is predictable and reliable, and they're going to have a basic sense of trust, right? So Erik Erikson in a later module, he's going to have like a bunch of different stages, and they're all framed as like a conflict. So he's going to say this earliest one from, birth to age 2 is the idea of trust versus mistrust. So as a young infant, are you going to be able to establish a sense of trust that the world is predictable and reliable, and you're going to have that trust and use that as you develop later in life in other relationships? Or are you going to develop a serious case of mistrust because things aren't predictable in your life? Like, your mom or your dad or whoever it might be, your caregiver never picks you up when you cry or doesn't comfort you. And so you now mistrust. And that forms the basis of later relationships, is what he's going to argue, right? So this early attachment is going to be the foundation for your adult relationships and your ability to have Like, how comfortable are you with affection? How comfortable you are with intimacy? And once again, this is just his theory, right? This is his argument. So this idea of trust versus mistrust, and that basic trust is crucial to your social development and your relationships later on in life. Question number 7 is talking about what effects does deprivation of attachment have in a child? So when we talk about deprivation of attachment, we could talk about, like, if we're talking about the loss of a parent, right? The parent not being present in a child's life. We could be talking about depriving attachment. Think of children that are in orphanages or in foster care, and they're constantly moving from house to house or place to place, and they don't have that secure attachment or any type of attachment. So what effect does depriving an infant or a child of attachment have? So your book kind of talks about different categories. Generally speaking, when an infant is deprived of attachment, they become withdrawn. Obviously, they're easily frightened. Sometimes actually it delays their development of speech, right? It's not like they're so shocked they're speechless, but like it delays their onset of their speech development, that lack of attachment. When we talk about orphanages, or you can talk about orphanages around the world, but generally speaking, orphanages, you don't see that word used a lot in the United States anymore, but there's a really low ratio of staff to children. And you could think about this like worldwide. There might be 100 kids in an orphanage and, 10 caregivers, right? So the amount of one-on-one time or even small group time that the children are going to have, they're going to experience they could experience a severe deprivation of attachment. When we talk about Harlow's monkeys that we're talking about with body contact, they did take monkeys and they would isolate them, right? They would, from birth, they're not around other monkeys. They're not around their quote unquote mother. And later on, they put those monkeys in with other monkeys of the same age. And they found that the isolated monkeys who were deprived of attachment, they would cower in fear, right? Or they became extremely aggressive towards any of the other monkeys in like the cage, essentially. So you can see that isolated monkeys, right, depriving them of attachment, they're frightful and they become more aggressive. Your book mentioned that many abusive parents, right, report having been neglected or battered themselves as children. But the thing to point out is that most abused children do not later become violent criminals or abusive parents, right? This demonstrates this idea of resiliency, right? Like breaking the cycle is a lot of times what you would hear it referred to and when people talk about it. What happens when you disrupt attachment? Generally speaking, when you take an infant and you put them in a more positive or stable environment, infants recover from separation distress very quickly, right? When we talk about children who are 6 months, right? So half a year old to 16 months, so just over a year, right? A year and a half. When you take them out of foster care, which would be a place where there's not necessarily significant attachment, and initially speaking, you would see some problems, right? So they're taken out of foster care. Let's say they're adopted. Initially, you might have difficulty with eating or sleeping, or they might struggle with connecting or relating to and having that attachment with their new caregiver or their mother or whoever it is in the family that adopted them. But then in the study, when they came back 10 years later, or like I guess you'd say 9 years later, and they studied these children who were then adopted. Remember, they were adopted between 6 and 16 months old, and then they followed up 10 years when they're 10 years old. There was little visible effect of that disruption of attachment, right? They were no worse than those young children who were adopted before the age of 6 months, right? Generally speaking, children adopted over the age of 2, they are at a higher risk for attachment issues or attachment disorders. Okay, the very last thing we're going to talk about is what are the different parenting styles, right? So when we're talking about your social development, one of the key parts of your social development is what we call child rearing practices. So rearing a child is raising a child. And your book says that there are 3 different parenting styles. The first one is referred to as authoritarian. Generally speaking, authoritarian parents, there is a lot of communication from parent to child, as in the parent is telling the child what to do. Communication's high that way, right? Parent tells the child what to do, imposing rules, expecting obedience, not questioning their authority. And once again, so communication is high from the parent to the child, but there's little communication from the child to the parent, right? Like there's not a whole lot of information flowing back to the parent. A lot of times you'd see these phrases from an authoritarian parenting style, like, you know, if you ask a question like, can I do this? And they're like, no. And you're like, why? Because I said so. Or don't interrupt me. Like, there's very clear expectations of rules without very many explanations. Generally speaking, it can have a detrimental effect on social skills and self-esteem. Once again, that's a general statement. The second type is permissive parenting. Generally speaking, if we're talking about communication, this is where communication is high from child to parent, as in the child kind of dictates what's going on, as opposed to the parent dictating the behavior and the rules. So there's high communication from child to parent, but not a lot of communication from parent to child. So this is where parents submit to their children's desires. There's very few demands and very few, if any, punishments. I gave you quotes from Mean Girls, which was based on a North Shore public school. And that's like, I'm not a regular mom, I'm a cool mom, right? That's kind of the line. There are no rules in this house. You can do whatever you want. It generally can lead to children being more aggressive or more immature. And the very last style is authoritative. If you think about it, it's kind of a mix of the first two. Parents are seen both as demanding, right? So the communication is still high from parent to child. Like, there are expectations and they expect you to follow those expectations and rules, but they're also responsive, right? As in, like, when their child has questions or they want to negotiate, maybe, you know, if the rule is you're always home by midnight and you ask your parent, like, can I please go to this concert even though I won't be home till 1 a.m. There's kind of a conversation about like what would be an appropriate response, or if I tell you no, what are my reasons for why you can't go? So like, they set rules, but they explain them. Generally speaking, children tend to have a better reaction to adjustment if they have authoritative parenting styles and maybe accomplish more. The thing I want to point out is that not every child needs the same parenting style, right? So when I think about like my family, right, with my older sister, I would say that my dad was probably more authoritarian, right? Like, these are the rules, I expect you to do them. And as sometimes often happens with authoritarian and teenagers, like when my sister got into high school, she started kind of rebelling, right? Pushing the rules, breaking the rules, was grounded, however that goes, right? And then I think my parents kind of made an adjustment, or at least my dad made adjustment, right? So when it was kind of my teenage years and the rules, that was more authoritative, right? So different children need different parenting styles, right? So if a parenting style isn't working in terms of the child not having success either academically or socially or whatever it might be, like, different parenting styles can be necessary. There isn't one that you could say is necessarily the one that's the best. I think they all depend upon a young adult's behavior, is kind of how I would say it. So those are the 3 different parenting styles: authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative. Okay. And you are done with your Module 48 video.